Welkom allemaal, welkom in Museum Boerhaave, in Salon Boerhaave vandaag. Today is the first of a series of lectures which goes along with the exhibition Besmet, Contaminated. My name is Sandra Rottenberg, ik ben Sandra Rottenberg, ik ben zelfstandig journalist en programmamaker en gevraagd om deze paar lezingen die we de komende weken hier hebben te begeleiden, te modereren. Het is mogelijk om vragen te stellen. It's possible to pose questions. It's a bit difficult because everybody's wearing a mask. I will repeat all the questions. People at home, mensen thuis, u kunt uw vraag intikken in de chat. En dan krijg ik die van collega Mathilde door op mijn WhatsApp. Dus ik zal straks af en toe op mijn telefoontje kijken. We hopen tussendoor dus dat er tijd is voor vragen en ook na afloop van de lezing. En we gaan vandaag luisteren naar een onderzoeker. Daniel Curtis, our speaker of today, is a historian from British descent. He's educated at the University of York, Cambridge and Utrecht, where he holds his PhD in social and economic history. Curtis is associate professor at the Erasmus Universiteit in Rotterdam. And his research concerns the social and economic effects of pandemics and disasters. And his efforts are recognized as his projects are supported by the NWO, Vidi and Veni grants. What I personally do like very much of the research of Daniel Curtis is that he has a feminist view on history. He is not afraid to look at the position of women, children, vulnerable people, and the influence and importance of a gender in history, which is something which has been long neglected in research. It is tempting to look at epidemics as traumatic shocks that cause great changes in society. And Daniel asked himself, is that true? And in that way, his research does reflect everything we are confronted with today. And that makes me have a question for Daniel to start with. Did you ever take into account, as you are for such a long time already doing research on pandemics, that you would live in a pandemic period yourself? And how does this affect you? The floor is yours.
Yeah, okay. That's a great question. Thanks also for the introduction. That was very nice. Yeah, obviously, I would say not. I don't think I ever thought that I would be carrying out my project, my 5-year project, within an actual pandemic. I think that would be very surprising. How is it affecting me? Well, of course, it makes research quite difficult. Sometimes you cannot travel to conferences and so on and so forth. But I think also one thing about the Low Countries, in particularly the Netherlands, the level of digitization of archival records is really, really good. It's a really positive thing, I think. Lots of things are accessible just from your own laptop. So in that sense, things can at least be done. No. Okay. Yeah, so it's really nice to offer this first talk of the Besmet series. I was meant to obviously be talking earlier in the year, but things got in the way. I will just stay very, very fixed here because the cameras are sort of fixed on me. I have a natural inclination to sort of move around the stage, but I think I have to remain fixed in place. And as Sandra suggested, so this presentation is basically a kind of narrative that I have constructed through the years of having MVO-funded research. And at the moment, my project basically looks at how epidemics have redistributed economic resources. Do they redistribute wealth? Do they redistribute property and so on? Things that I think we are thinking about today, right? In terms of historical research, or more recent historical research on epidemics, I think one thing that stands out to me is this notion of change. Many scholars seem to come to the conclusion that epidemics, one way or another, create societal change. So this could be either in the contributing to the decline or even the formalization of states. It can be redistributing economic resources, pushing economies down different paths. It could be socio-cultural change. So perhaps epidemics make societies more cohesive, more compassionate, or maybe they have the opposite. Maybe they have a fragmenting effect. Do epidemics affect public health infrastructure and how we approach public health infrastructure? Also, another classic idea is this notion that epidemics have or are a kind of an opportunity for authorities and elites to use fears over the sickness, fears over contagion, to apply supervisory controls, extra controls within society. Sometimes, it's, especially in colonial context, when we look to the past, this is even physical controls over people's bodies. But always this is with the message that this is for the common good, in the interests of public health. So I think I'll get back to the issue of whether epidemics create change more towards the end of the presentation. But what I think should be very much cast out of your mind, thrown away out of your mind, is the idea that epidemics are shocks, are sudden shocks. And we might think that because we are now living in a time which is quite unusual, and maybe we've never experienced conditions like this before. But if we look to pre-modern history, so to the medieval period, to the early modern period, epidemics happen very frequently. They are almost part of everyday life. They happen again and again. So I just provided some mortality data that I collected for Haarlem, using the Klok and Graaf boeken. And this is across a period of 3 centuries, and all I just want to show is look at those repeat spikes. Again and again, epidemics occurring within a short space of time. So I think the points that I want to just establish in this presentation, the narrative that I establish. Epidemics are not rupture points, but actually regular occurrences incorporated into the rhythms of everyday life. People remember epidemics. Their experience is passed down from generation to generation, and they also inform how people behave. What I will go on to show is that actually many of the institutions and societal responses to epidemics in the past, not really about change, actually more about reinforcing the status quo, reinforcing norms, traditions. And then my final summary is that epidemics should not be seen as sharp, sudden shocks leading to rapid change, but actually the link between epidemics and society, at least in the pre-modern period, is something established very slowly, incrementally, over the long term. What I want to start with is this book by Leo Noordegraaf and Gerrit Volk. And this is a book from 1980s, and it's quite a famous book, at least by Dutch standards. This is a very famous book. And I think also, probably still, despite the fact written in the 80s, probably the best work written on plague for the Low Countries, I think. But I also want to focus a little bit on one of the argumentations, which is an important part of this book, which is that early modern plague within Holland and, let's say, the broader Dutch Republic left no element of society untouched, reaping chaos and unrest wherever it appeared. And this is kind of supported by three things. The idea that the epidemics create fear, panic, chaos. The idea that they create opportunities for the application of social controls. And the idea that epidemics also inevitably lead to scapegoating of vulnerable, weak, powerless people. And I think also another thing that we are seeing quite commonly with studies on society and plague in particular is a top-down approach. This is a book written actually this year, and it's also a very nice, finely researched book. And this kind of approach is always from the top down. So using government ordinances, resolutions, forms of governmental legislation to say something about what's happening during an epidemic outbreak. What I think, or what I've begun to notice across the course of my research, let's say over the past 10 years, I've come to the conclusion that maybe things are not always that way around. So rather than being a kind of instrument of social control, epidemics also can become a context for those at the bottom of society to offer their frustrations, their fears, their anxieties, often directed at elites and authorities. And I just point to two important events. I could have chosen many different ones, but this is just two that stood out to me. One is a revolt in Groningen in 1623 during a plague. Ordinary people directed against those people employed to carry the corpses to the burial sites. And in fact, these people were even attacked and stones were thrown at them. Also similar, in Brussels, we see violent resistance against pestmeesters, those in charge of the pesthousen, who came to occupy vacant houses along a street under the instructions of the government, of the local government. And again, this created uproar within the streets. Two things that I want to say about these cases. First of all, this is not against vulnerable people. This is those at the bottom of society, those ordinary people directing their discontent, their fears against elites, authorities, or at least agents of the administration, perceived agents of the administration. Secondly, this is not some form of radicalism or revolution from below, but this is using violence, chaos, extreme measures to protect ordinary things, normal things, traditions, customary practices, things people hold dear. Why were the corpse carriers in Groningen, why were they attacked? Does anybody even have an idea?
They were blamed for transmitting the disease.
They were blamed? Yes, okay, yes.
Can you repeat the question or the answer?
Yeah. So the question, why would ordinary people attack people, with the occupation of carrying the bodies to the burial sites? Why would they do that?
Does anybody have an idea? it's quite the same as what happens now. The aggression people in healthcare are
Right,
confronted
okay.
with.
Exactly, yes. That's exactly...
Can you repeat?
So the answer is
said.
basically that this is the ordinary people saw this as a kind of tradition, as something that people hold dear, and is an important part. So rather than being scared of the bodies and being scared of being infected, people actually hold more importance in actually taking their relatives or their kin or their family to the burial site themselves. They don't want somebody employed, and this is the essence behind it. Sorry.
Another question, or no?
Yeah, sorry. And sometimes this is not always violence or extreme actions. It's not always the case. Sometimes it's more just passive resistance, foot dragging. And this can manifest itself in many different ways, I think, in the sources. So from the woman that refuses to carry the white stick out in public because... So often what happened is that people had to carry a white stick to show that they were infected. We have cases where people just refuse to carry it. In one case, we have the man that refuses to shut off his house, refuses to abandon his house because his wife has been infected. We have in the criminal records somebody who commits the crime of not hanging out the straw in front of their house to indicate that their house is infected. But they don't pay the fine, they don't pay a second fine, there's no punishment. And I think this is an important thing to put forward, is that you can focus on all the different kinds of regulations that cities and urban governments made in order to control public health and behavior, but you have to have the other side of things, which is also reception and actually policing these rules on the street itself. And this is not always the case. This is just another example I took, I thought was quite interesting, of resistance and foot dragging. So this is a case from Den Dungen in Brabant. And you have this case where two parents have died of the plague suddenly, and you have children that have survived. They are asked to be brought to a place of isolation, so some isolated huts on the moorlands, but they simply refuse to go. And there's nothing anyone can really do about it. So you can see even children here are showing resistance to what is being asked of them. And we might think that a lot of public health regulation in the medieval, the early modern period was applied from above by governments. But that's not always the case. So here we have an example from the Gerechtsdagboeken in Leiden in the plague year of 1603. And here we have a case where local residents are actually complaining about migrants coming to their streets, especially from Flanders, from Wallonia, and dumping the products of the textile trade in the grachten, on the streets, and so on. What actually happens in the end, and I've underlined it at the bottom, so the local residents actually petition the city to punish the polluters and erect a warning sign. So it's completely turning the logic around. This is ordinary people petitioning government to do something about public health. So that's social cohesion. I just thought I'd throw out some interesting examples. Is there anything quantitative that we can say about how epidemics change societies and economies? And as I said at the beginning, one of the things that I'm really interested in is how epidemics shape inequality? Do they make societies more equal or unequal? That is sort of the subject of what I am looking at, in a way. But it's quite a difficult topic for historians, especially as you go back into the past. And one of the reasons is that we rarely have a source that can say something about the distribution of property just before an epidemic, and something which can show distribution of property just after an epidemic. Very, very rarely we have that kind of nice information. Fortunately, I was able to find quite a valuable source, though. This is the Feldbuchen, which I found for 17th century Oudenbosch. This is not Den Bosch, but Oudenbosch. This is a little village in West Brabant. It's just an ordinary village. It has probably nothing special. Well, it has a basilica, right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But apart from that, perhaps just an ordinary village. And the nice thing about this source is that it allows me to reconstruct land ownership for every single year, so either side of an epidemic. So with the source that I've put on the slide, in the middle you have the land owner, and on the left-hand side you have the people that are using the land, the farmers themselves, because this is not always the same person. So I just thought I would show this sort of visually. So here, the black lines, the black vertical lines, represent epidemic outbreaks in this village. We don't have mortality information for this village, but I am able to figure out these are epidemic years by just other kinds of documentary sources in Oudenbosch. So you have ordinances, letters from the magistrates, all this kind of stuff, basically. And then the blue line represents the distribution of land within the village as measured by a Gini coefficient. I'm not sure if everybody knows what a Gini coefficient is, but put in sort of the basic terms, I suppose, the higher the Gini coefficient, the more unequal a society is, the more unequal the distribution of property is. And I think what you can see from this graph is that after those major epidemic outbreaks, you see a decline in the Gini. You see a decline in inequality. And this pretty much happens in all four of the main epidemics there. But also there is actually one of the reasons for this. One of the sort of causal mechanisms behind this is because when somebody dies, like in an epidemic, the property goes to heirs, people inherit that property, and often it's split between a number of different children, and that's one of the mechanisms which actually leads to more equal distribution of property. But another thing about this graph you can probably see is that the decline is very, very modest. It's very small, and also over the long term, it makes no difference. So after a few years, inequality rises again. And if you compare the end of the century to the beginning of the century, there's not much difference. So over the long term, not much structural change. So far, what I've argued is that epidemics, I don't really see as sudden shocks, and I don't really see them leading to significant structural changes. What I am suggesting is that often you see short-term social resistance to change, and while sometimes you might see short-term changes in the distribution of property and so on, in the long term, often this makes no difference. It doesn't matter. However, one thing that we should not downplay, even if we do not think that epidemics create structural change, epidemics do cause suffering. That is obvious. And this burden could be experienced unequally. And we see that today, right? During the COVID-19 outbreak, it's not experienced equally by age, it's not by socio-economic status, it's not equal by gender, ethnicity, etc., etc. So I want to explore this issue a little bit down the lines of gender. And what I'm going to show to you is two things. First, I'm going to show you some demographic evidence that I've collected over the years, which I show suggests that women become more exposed to chances of dying than men during epidemics. And then I will show you some sort of anecdotal documentary evidence I found in different sources, which point to different kinds of burdens that medieval and early modern women had to face during times of epidemics. So the demographic evidence I have reconstructed out of three sources. The first one is together with a PhD student, and in fact the PhD student has done the majority of the work here, also defended his thesis, Joris Roosen, at Utrecht University. And this is the Mortman registers for the county of Hainaut in southern Belgium in the late Middle Ages. And what these documents are is a register of men and women that died, and the amount of tax or the best property that they had to pay to a territorial lord upon death. So it's like a death tax. I don't have time to obviously explain all the nuances and everything of this, but all I want to show is the key information is in the red box. So during plague years, based on this source, the sex ratio in mortality, it declines when compared to those years without the plague. So relative to normal times, during epidemics, more women are dying than men. Second source, as I've already mentioned, is this Klok and Graaf register. This is for Haarlem, and it is connected to the Sint Bavo church within Haarlem. And it's a similar kind of thing. So it also lists how many people per year, men and women, were dying, and it lists whether they received the grave being dug up for them to be buried, or whether they received the bells being tolled at the church as a signal of somebody dying. And again, so just in the red box has actually shifted a little bit. It should be a little bit down, but the red box should actually be the very bottom two, 0.95 and 1.08. That's the interesting information. And again, it shows that during mortality crises, more women died during epidemics than men, when we compare that to normal years. Final source is the burial registers. And this is, so over the years I've collected information from early modern burial registers for over 300 places all across the Low Countries. And this comes to around 2 million burials in this big database. And this source is also very nice. You can actually just access it freely online. Most of it's digitized. It's very well digitized in the Netherlands and Belgium. And again, put all the information together. During severe mortality crises, the sex ratio in mortality tends to go down when compared to ordinary years, which suggests more women are dying during those years. And this kind of finding might seem a little bit strange to anyone that knows about the effects of sex differentials in mortality and disease, because modern laboratory research tends to suggest that women are more resistant to bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi than men, which cause most diseases. I think there's only a few exceptions, such as malaria and maybe measles, I think, but usually women have a natural advantage. So what this suggests, perhaps, is that women have a natural advantage, but in the context of the late medieval, early modern Low Countries, there were certain gender inequalities within society which put women in a more exposed position, being closer to points of contagion, being closer to vectors which cause disease. And I think a big part of this, likely, is the gender-based inequalities in care provision. Definitely the case that women were more likely to provide care within their own households, but also most schrobbers were women. This is an occupation seen during epidemics where people would go into other people's houses and be paid for caring and disinfecting the houses. Sometimes, if the person had died, they would place the corpse in the coffin. And they would even hear the last testament of that person if the priest had refused to actually enter into the property. And we see here in this little manuscript, it says that Leijs Peters was a schrobster, and she worked in a house for seven weeks. So that's quite a long time to be working in someone's house. But women also did other public health tasks that were very dangerous. One of the things was codifying corpses, that is, basically establishing the cause of death of a corpse. So if you think that, for example, in Leiden in 1635, a third of the population died, that's too many deaths for the priest or the medic to actually go around to each individual house and establish cause of death. So this task was actually passed to frequently older women. But also women did many other things during these times. Such as
Daniel, maybe, is there someone
Yes.
wants to ask something? Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
We'll try it this way.
Right now, COVID is affecting more men, I thought, than women. So at this time, it's the opposite, I thought.
Yeah, but that's what you
It's
explained.
an interesting
But
question.
maybe you can explain it again. It's lady says nowadays with COVID-19, it seems that men are more vulnerable to the disease than women are. But in general, women are more.
Well, it's a good question. Thanks for your question. What I would say is that you cannot always make the same parallel with what is happening in pre-modern context, so in the pre-modern times, in the medieval, early modern times, to what is happening today, because different diseases work differently. But also, I think there are different dimensions to COVID-19. So, yes, maybe men are more at risk of dying. I think that's been established so far. But then there are other forms of inequality. For example, it's been suggested that women have to retreat away from work and are more likely to have to do tasks connected with the home because of the lockdown situation, for example, and the fact that we are working more at home. More likely to even lose jobs, in fact. Women are more likely to be working on the front line of service industries, it's also been suggested. So I think there are different components to this.
What I did understand, what you just came to say,
Yeah.
was that women are naturally more stronger or more resistant to
Yes,
these viruses than men are, and it depends on the social circumstances, what their work is, how they are confronted
Right.
with sick,
That's
ill
the
people,
point.
what affects the way that
Yeah.
they die or
Yes.
are
Yes. Yeah, so the idea is that women are biologically speaking more likely to survive a particular disease than man, if all things being equal, if they experience the same conditions.
yeah.
But we know that life is not like that, right? And societies are organized very, very differently, just like in the early modern period and the medieval period. And social inequalities can lead to, for example, people being more likely to be in exposed situations, more likely to come into contact with others who are infected. So these kinds of inequalities also affect sex ratios in mortality. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there other questions?
Yes, thank you. Do you have any data on how the age distribution was before and after then the epidemics, or who died, what kind of women died more? And it can be that children were more affected, or we know that old ladies survived old men, of course,
Yeah.
and they were maybe more susceptible. So for me it looks like that it became more equal. So before epidemic more men died than women, and during the epidemic it became almost equal.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more? I tried to repeat the question.
No, but it's a very,
do
it's
you
a very
have
good
more
question.
detailed data in how along the pandemic was going on, if there were differences between age, children and women, and if they were vulnerable or became slachtoffer of the pandemic?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. It's a very good question. And it's probably good for me to point out that all the data I have and showed there, that's all adults. So no children below the age of 16. There is a reason for that, because children sometimes appear in those records, but not systematically. So we cannot, we have to kick them out, basically, of this assessment. You're right, it would be great if we had not only male, female, but also more refined age brackets for who, so that would be great, of course. But yeah, medieval, early modern documents don't allow that very, very often, and not in those kinds of sources. So we don't have ages of death very often, and only really from the 19th century, when you get better censuses, do you have all that kind of interesting stuff, which is really nice to have. Yeah.
There's a better administration. From
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Time on.
Yeah. We have to make do with what we have in the early modern period. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Well, let's go on.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm not too far from the end. One thing I would also say is that during epidemics, often women found themselves in a situation which could lead to some form of persecution, or at least danger. So I just threw in a few examples that I have found in different sources, different literature. Where you have this example from this Brabant village, where a man bound the feet of his maid, despite the fact that she was sick with the plague, while he went out drinking, and was fined by the local government 10 guilders for doing so. But also women working in other people's houses as robbers and so on often brought other kinds of dangers. So, for example, we often see in magistrates' accounts women being accused of being deliberate plague spreaders, infecting door handles, and so on. And the case that I put at the bottom is very interesting, I think, because it's even the woman's own husband that has decided to accuse her of killing off those people suffering with plague. That is, I guess, quite an extreme example. This is also quite a nice example, I thought. This is from Delft in a plague of 1665. Here we have 2 women punished and sent into a house of correction because they were previously put into a pest house, presumably because they had the plague or some symptoms which may have been plague. And yet they decided to escape, visit others within the community, and eventually had to be taken in as actual fugitives. And then they were thrown into the house of correction. This is quite a good find, I think. One of the big elements of, so we've already mentioned it, the question at the front, the importance of burial culture and funerals to medieval and early modern people. That's really, really important today, right, I think as well, to a certain degree. One of the things here is that women were often banned from funerals during epidemic diseases. And I found that in many, many different cases, Amersfoort, Delft, Leiden, Haarlem, all these cases, probably if I did it a bit more properly, I would find many, many more cases. And also I liked this example in the Noordergraven Volk book, where they actually give a rationale. So they suggest that women's presence at these funerals increased the danger of contaminated air rising from the graves. Quite interesting, I think. And this, I think, is part of a whole broader process of behavior regulation and a kind of female spreader narrative, I would say. And we can see this female spreader narrative across cultures and across time, all kinds of different contexts. But I just wanted to end with this example. This is quite a nice one as well. This is a plague ordinance from the town of Schluis, where the infection of the city during this time of plague was linked to God's wrath at loose women and whores. And I underlined in the red on the document the bit. And so sex workers were actually ordered at this time to leave the city, were forced to leave the city. No one was allowed to take them in to taverns, to inns. Then they should be reported to the authorities. So, just want to sort of sum up. These are the main points that I would put forward, I think, in my research so far. Epidemics in the pre-modern Low Countries, not shocks at all, but they are repeat occurrences, anticipated occurrences. People adapt to these things and were integrated within the sort of rhythms of everyday life. Rather than creating sort of long-lasting structural change, I think institutions and people themselves try to work to maintain the status quo, to maintain ordinary, the title of the presentation, preserving the ordinary. Epidemics weren't just tools of the powerful to create social control, but also ordinary citizens used times of epidemics to push back against things that they saw as arbitrary or nonsense or conflicted with ordinary stuff that people wanted to do. And I think we also see a little bit of that today, right? I think to either in a more extreme way through protesting or in a bit more of a passive way through just not conforming entirely to regulations, let's say. And I think the final thing I want to say is that just because I don't believe in this kind of structural change, we should not lose sight of the fact, of course, that people suffer during epidemics. And this suffering wasn't the same for every single person. It was socially differential. And I think for historians, at least, probably our contribution over the next years can be to look at how epidemics affect the welfare of people that are not just adult males of working age, but women, the elderly, children, and other demographic groups, let's say. So that is all, I think. I I come to the end.
Well,
Thank you for.
thank you so much. Thank you. Applause for you. And then we might have other questions. Also, standing here, for people who are looking from home, please type in your question at the chat modus of Zoom. Another question and another question. Yes, I'll come first here.
Yes. Do you have any information about spreading caused by women causing witch hunts?
Do you have any information on spreading infections by women and causing witch hunts?
Yeah,
Heksenjacht.
that is also a good question, and well, it is a little bit connected to that example I showed from Holland, even though this is not really a witch hunt, let's say. But I think in the southern Netherlands, so in what is today Belgium, we do have a lot more cases of witch hunting in general in the early modern period. And sometimes we do find instances where it is connected to, for example, somebody cursing somebody with language, so verbally cursing someone with the pestilence or something like that. But probably we don't have that many cases. I think they're probably like special cases, but maybe quantitatively not too many.
There's not a direct connection between plagues and witch hunting.
I'm not sure about it. Maybe there has to be more sort of systematic work done on the topic, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was a question. Thank you.
I would like to ask you what means NWO, and what I read on the screen, 2016, 2018, 250,000 euro.
Yes.
Yes,
so,
it's about your grant.
yeah. Good question. Good question. Yes, this is the NVO is like the Dutch research council, and they provide money for researchers working at universities. To do research basically, and to build research projects.
Is that given to different scientists?
Yes. So I think probably the pot of money is bigger for those working in the natural sciences, but you can also, of course, get this money working in humanities and the social sciences and so on.
We can talk about this afterwards. I would like to focus now on the lecture much more, and we can explain more about the grants afterwards.
It's a good question.
But it's very interesting. In what way are we interested? In what kind of research we need nowadays, especially if historical research reflects on what we live nowadays. And here are some questions from people at home, from Lorenzo Salvioni, and he says overpopulation must have been a major contributing factor. Did authorities back then ever take any measures to keep population in check after society had finally come out of the epidemic? So did you find some proofs of authorities busy with regulation and...
No, it's a good question again, and I think, well, if I use the early modern period, say the 16th and 17th century as an example, what I tend to find is that in the aftermath of epidemics, so in the years just after, there is a greater amount of restrictions and legislation targeting vagrants, so landlopers. Definitely in the minds of local authorities, this is an issue, and they are drawing connections between migration into cities and epidemic outbreaks, and they want to deal with that. So to some extent, yes, I think that could be a...
It could be possible,
Yeah,
but...
yeah. Could be.
There's another question from Bob. Based on your research, do you have any recommendations for us in the current pandemic? What can we learn from the past?
Yes, well, I don't always think it's about learning from the past, and I don't think that is always the objective of history. But I do think that at least the past can be something so we don't get lost. We don't get lost in this kind of myopia. We don't think that what is happening now is absolutely exceptional and never ever
Lived before.
unprecedented. So I think we have a reference point to go back to. But also I think we should, maybe I would say this as a historian, but I think we should be a little bit careful about making big claims about exactly what is happening, because this is in motion, this is right now. And what I find is that there are quite some historians saying, let's say, provocative things or big ideas, especially in the early stages of the pandemic, and then a couple of months later, it's wrong. It's nonsense. It doesn't make sense. So I think we should also take a little bit of a step back, be a bit careful, and maybe reflect in the next years about exactly what has happened here and the consequences.
We cannot say that yet.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. There's another question from Bob. I have read that the fall of the Roman Empire was partly due to pandemics coming from Parthia. Do you agree? The fall of the Roman Empire.
Yes.
Was there any pandemic
I did show right at the beginning, so I showed that book, The Fate of Rome. So that is probably an example of...
Oh yeah, the fate of Rome.
Yeah. What Bob is referring to, so this idea that perhaps the decline of the Roman Empire is connected with outbreaks of disease. Also, that's not the only argument that he makes. So also, he suggests that it's connected to climate change as well. To be honest, I'm not a specialist on antiquity and the Roman period. So, my opinion is probably not that valuable, let's say. But I think it could be plausible. But as with everything, I think we should also avoid being deterministic about this and just say, oh, it's just because of epidemic or it's just because of climate change. It's maybe disease, climate, interacting with stuff that actually happens in people's lives, social systems, economic systems, other kinds of things. So probably there is more to it than that.
But I'm curious how you reflect on what Daniel just learned us, that overall the societal changes were not that big as we think. That is what is new in your research. You show us all these books claiming that pandemics have changed cultural and societal and economical change. And you disagree with that. How do you feel about that? Reflecting on our own times, what we are living now. Shall we go to a different society, or will the system what Daniel describes be more strong, that we go back as soon as possible, back to normal? How do you reflect on that? Is there anyone?
Yeah, I would hope that because of the reflection we have been doing, that we will realize that corona is a problem, and it's quite a big problem. But for example, the climate crisis or the lack of sustainability of our famous way of living needs to be reconsidered. And we should, with corona,
Is good.
Maar even een kapje af. Ik sta op afstand.
With corona, we have taken sometimes, very quick action and doing, things to move things in a better direction. But with the climate, for example, in the recent past, we have not shown that kind of determination to say that it's a very big problem, we should tackle it. So I was hoping that maybe we would have learned from this epidemic that we would do that better for climate and for the sustainability of our society.
You hope
Yes.
that this
But
pandemic
that,
will stimulate.
it's an important that word hope because
Maybe we should repeat the question. No. Everybody heard? You did understand? Okay.
yeah, but that is important sort of qualifier here, hope. So I think we are saying a lot of things about we're thinking about what this means for a lot of what we do in society, right? Globalization, inequality, gender inequality, climate change, all this stuff. We're starting to think how we work, you know, whether we could do more working from home, everything basically. But, well, it's one thing to say these things and to be thinking about them and have them in our minds, but it's quite a different thing for the structural change, so the actual change to occur. Let's see, I think that's a long-term process, and I don't know, I'm not necessarily convinced it will occur.
That we will come to a fast change.
No, I don't think
No.
I don't think so. But you know, we will see. I hope so.
Who likes to contribute to this? Or have another question? Or maybe on what you will research for in the future? Where is your research going to? Do you have new plans, a new subject?
Well, as I said, I'm still working on the research project which lasts until 2024. So I'm still on the subject of how epidemics redistribute resources, whether they make societies wealthier, more unequal or more equal, and how. What are the mechanisms there? How? In which circumstances does that occur? So that's basically what I'm doing. I think that maybe with this pandemic, there is a little bit of a danger of epidemic overkill for me. So like, you're living the epidemic, and then it's your work, and maybe it is a bit too much, but you know, let's see. Yeah.
There are not new questions raised for you that you think I would be very curious about other fields now.
Yeah, well,
bring me from pandemics to another.
I think it's more
social
the
fields.
other way around. So I was thinking about all these things about how epidemics affect cohesion and the effects from the bottom up and how they redistribute resources, like for many years. And then suddenly, this year, they're actually front page, we are living them. So I don't think it's actually made me rethink new things, but more, well, I guess it's quite a good thing, at least for me, in the sense that it reinforces to me that I'm working on relevant topics and
Yes.
relevant things.
Nobody was interested in it.
Suddenly,
but
yes.
now.
Yeah.
There is 12 years ago, I probably remember, a biologist, and he wrote a book, Zoonose, a very thick book. And
Yeah.
nobody of politics or scientists have ever brought it into
into the world or
publish
in
it.
public attention.
React on this book. And there was in 28 a film, Contagious, and they warned about a pandemic. It is all about pandemics coming from China. And it's a very intriguing film. I saw it some months ago. And you know, it's all, there are people who know the things, but they will not be listening to.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that's the classic case of, you know, researchers do stuff and researchers say stuff, but it only becomes sort of in popular consciousness through other kinds of events, right? It takes something else to put it into the mind. It's like the film that you mentioned, Contagion from 2011. Yeah, probably before quite relatively popular, but not that popular, let's say, and maybe people thought it was not the greatest film. But suddenly, 2020, it's like the top of the iTunes and all this kind of thing. So it takes stuff sometimes to happen for research, and
researchers are sometimes the Cassandras of their own time. No,
right.
They predict what will go on, but nobody believes them.
As a reflection, for me, it sounds really interesting to draw connections between the medieval times and plagues, because the knowledge, the scientific knowledge, increased so much since then, and we could understand the situations behind these epidemics now. But still, the reactions and all the societal changes are resembling what was happening beforehand, and probably you're right, and the change will not be that shocking after this one, so we want to get back to the usual stuff. But it's interesting just to know that we understand what is happening still. We blame others, we blame other groups, we do nothing, we don't change. It's intriguing.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. I think we may finish with this conclusion and look at ourselves now. Thank you so much,
Thanks for
Daniel.
inviting me. Yeah, thank you.
I saw there was a publication where one was with an article of your hand, which appeared this year at Cambridge, and which you can download.
Yes,
Is that interesting for people who want to know more?
Yeah, that's a new book. It's not just my work, so it's also written with other co-authors.
Yeah, there are different articles.
Yeah, and it's a book. It's available open access online, so it's completely free to access and download. And that is on disasters and history, so the vulnerability and resilience of past societies, basically. So it is quite connected, but it's not just about epidemics. So it's also about famines and earthquakes and floods and how societies deal with all these terrible things. Yeah.
Okay, if you want to read a recent article of Daniel Curtis, you can find it there. Thank you so much for coming
thank you
and participating. Also, people who were watching us from home, thank you for watching and participating. And next week we will have another lecture where you are cordially invited. And we then will have Manon Perry. She's professor in medical history, and she will talk about silent epidemics and the forgotten histories of HIV and AIDS. So I hope to see you back then. And if you want to ask anything, I think you can still write or email the Boerhaave Museum. And thank you again, Daniel. Lots of success with your research.
Thank you.
And well, have a good afternoon. See you bye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Let's take this off.
Tot hoe laat is het museum nog open? Tot 5 uur. Het museum is nog open tot 5 uur, dus u kunt nog de tentoonstelling even bezoeken. Dat is zeer de moeite waard. Kan je dan daar eruit? Maar nee, je moet die kant op. Moet weer terug, die kant op, ja. Ben je tevreden? Ja? Fijn. Ja, hartslag, dat is iets uit het